we've heard an awful lot about kind of where the market has been, where it may be going, how it might get there. And I wanted to get up here with this final opportunity to kind of wrap up what we've talked about these last couple of days and take a chance to look forward, look ahead at maybe the next year, the next 2 years, the next 3 years, even further out ahead if we're able to even think about projecting that far. Before I go ahead, I do want to take an opportunity to thank all of our sponsors. Hopefully you had a chance to talk to them out at their booths, out in the lobby over the course of the last couple of days. If not, certainly I'm sure they would appreciate you reaching out. We can certainly provide contact information if you haven't had a chance to talk to any of them. Certainly without them, this show wouldn't have been possible. Also, 2 websites for you to remember going forward, just to keep pace with all of these topics. sdnzone.com and nfvzone.com. Those are our 2 content sites for all of the related topics that we've been discussing today. So without further ado, let's get into some of this looking forward and talk about what the telco and the software telco is going to look like with Steve Gleave. You all remember Steve from yesterday morning. He kicked off our event. He's the Senior Vice President of Marketing at Metaswitch Networks. Steve, welcome again.
Thank you. Thank you.
And hopefully you all remember Chris Kenneman. He's the Vice President of AdTran's Blue Socket Division from earlier today. Chris, good to see you again.
Likewise.
So one of the things, it's clear that the majority of the people that have, I'll even go as far as saying everybody that we've spoken with these 2 days believes, to use the word that Steve kicked off the event with, there's got to be belief that software is going to be a huge part of the telco environment going forward. There's some debate whether it's going to be completely software or whether there's still some proprietary hardware involved. But what's the difference as we look forward over the next couple of years between telcos that have already recognized and may be on the path to becoming software-centric versus those that are still embracing only their current model, haven't recognized the need to move forward into software? How do you compare those 2? What's going to happen?
Way to go, Chris?
Oh, yeah.
All right.
I'll form some thoughts, yeah.
Yeah, borrow this. I think the main thing is just embracing this ultimate goal of a sort of homogeneous environment. It was fascinating. I was privy to a conversation with a service provider a few weeks ago where, in talking about software telco architectures and really understanding network function virtualization, there was still this fascination with, well, do the servers need to be NEBS compliant? Which was just a really sort of odd question. There's still this centric thinking of, well, something's got to go in a CO here. Do I go and buy separate DNS and separate load balancers from the ones I may have been using in my IT infrastructure? And the reality is no. The move to the software telco is saying single infrastructure for IT, single infrastructure for network elements, single infrastructure for stuff you're testing, stuff that's in beta, stuff that you're running and that you are servicing the customers. And I think that it's that mindset that says this is going to change. And it's not just the telco mindset, it's the supplier mindset. And I know we're kind of wrapping as well with this. I've been really encouraged being here because I think Cassidy said this from Alcatel that typically we can be competitors, but clearly we're all part of the same sort of goal here. Talking to Paul over at Genban, it's just refreshing to see the vendors who have historically had different positions on how to do things kind of agreeing on what's required here. And I think if the telcos can get to that level of agreement that things are changing, and if some of those more nascent OEMs understand the things that have to change as well, we should be working towards this common infrastructure that satisfies all these goals. And that, to me, more than anything, I mean, yes, embracing open source, that's a good thing. Yes, feeling more web-centric than maybe sort of utility-oriented, that's a good thing. But it's understanding this common infrastructure and how the parts play that I think will really characterize companies that are going to get there.
Yeah, underscore something that you said on, and actually we spoke about this earlier, on I've been on panel discussions, and it's interesting that the complexion of those panel discussions, depending on where the market is moving. If you're early on, right, all the traditional, although we're not competitors, we're buddies in the other way, but we're up here with Alcatel-Lucid. But if it's early on, when a movement is happening, all of us are kind of happy together, and we're all the same. Now, late in a market, then we're up here fighting, which can be very entertaining, by the way, if we're up here doing that. But it's interesting how early, when an early movement, we're all together and we're moving and we're trying to move it together. I did notice in a lot of the presentations, we talk about the service providers and if they're slow and if they're deliberate. And I've always wondered, if we had service providers in here, they would probably rapidly defend themselves as to why they operate in that way. And a lot of service providers like to remind me of, well, I remember ISDN, and I remember WAP, Wireless Access Protocol. I remember all these things that all you vendors said was going to change the world, and it didn't. So if I'm skeptical, and if I'm skeptical about network functions virtualization, you have to realize that I have to be wary of head fakes that go on out there. And now, I don't think this is a head fake, network functions virtualization, and the fact that a paper was written on it, I think one of the presentations pointed out the paper that was written about a year ago in October, participated with several of the leading service providers, indicates that this is not a head fake. But I think as suppliers, we have to be sympathetic to our customers that they have seen some head fakes from the supplier community in the past, and they're going to remain skeptical, even with something like network functions virtualization.
I mean, I think if I was a service provider, I'd actually almost commend the vendor community on this, because if you take this to the absolute extreme and it just becomes a software business and we're all writing applications, I mean, if you want to compare it with anything that's out there today, it's literally like going to the iTunes store when you're looking for an app. And there are reviews on there, and you say, I like this one, don't like that one, stars up, stars down. I mean, you're literally going to get to the point where you are buying apps of people who historically have protected their turf. Metaswitch has said, we do this, Genban's over here, and Alcatel, and Ericsson, and all of these companies. And we've always had reasons to differentiate ourselves because, well, you need to get that solution from us, right? Because this box, this box, this box. If we're moving to a software-only architecture, and to your point, is this a head fake? It's kind of a heck of a strange head fake if we all want to sort of almost level the playing field and say, literally, we're going to be software vendors. We're going to sell licenses, and you might see reviews on our products. And, quite frankly, it may get as simple as, yeah, tried that, didn't like it, went with another vendor. And that's a hugely risky situation for us. So I think we've all got to really believe in the ultimate value of what this brings. And I think that's very different from some of the things before that always kind of favored a vendor when they were being promoted.
Steve, you kind of hinted at with your first comment, touching on standards and standardization. It's something that didn't necessarily get talked about an awful lot today or yesterday, but I'm sure everybody out there knows that Etsy released it's the first set of standards around NFV very recently, just a few weeks ago. What is the impact? What does that mean, for the software telco world, and is that just the beginning of a lot more out of organizations like Etsy, or are there going to be challenges with standards? That's nothing that we haven't seen in the telecom world in the past.
I think you're on a really, really key point here, and it's actually the syntax of it. They're not standards. They're specifications.
Yeah, I agree. It's more principles. When I read it, it's principles.
It's absolutely. And in fact, when the operators put that paper together and it got sort of moved, the evolution of that paper got moved under the auspices of Etsy, which of course is a standards body, and it has this ISG working group, which sounds standards. It's not. It's specifications. And if you look at the specifications, they're hugely complex. It's not that they're just like, as a recommendation, go software. I mean, you get in about page 2, you're like, man, my head hurts. But they are complex documents, but the operators were specific. We don't want standards. We want recommendations, specifications on how to best this, because the vendor community will never get there fast enough if we go through standards. I used to talk about RCS and the mobile industry. I mean, that started in 2000 with the ITU, this total conversation, and they went through 3GPP for MMTEL, then they went off to GSMA, and it was RCS, and it was joint. 13 years later, nobody had rolled it out. And I think the operators looked at this and says, we can't have that again. So the key is its specifications, and specifications give a lot of us the freedom to move this thing forward without waiting for all of the sign-offs.
I think I see what Etsy is trying to do. There's a magic balance that you have to, if you're a body like Etsy, and it's you've got to get some form and direction to an industry, so it's just not a bunch of cacophony of different things that are going on, and so you have to give it some direction in that sense. But you can over-specify it,
right,
and to where there's no innovation. And I think probably one governing body that I think got it right and is the Wi-Fi Alliance is a good example of that. The Wi-Fi Alliance gives enough standards out there that, okay, so things will interoperate, so your device can, connect to any sort of access point, but not too much to where there cannot be any innovation. So I think that any standards body has to find that fine line, and I think that's where they're going. That's what they're trying to do, and that's why I think it's more around principles. It's quite complex, you're absolutely right, but not to over-standardize it where there can be no innovation and then no vendor is interested in participating in it.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to understand we're at a real inflection point here. I mean, one of the drivers behind NFV, which I don't think we've touched on in the last few days, is that when you have proprietary hardware as part of your software, it really reduces the number of players that can come into that market. Because if you've got to be able to support the chap from SciScios and so whatever was talking about this earlier with hardware. If you've got to be able to support 5,000 new PSUs we got to switch out. You've got those hardware limitations. It clears the playing field for these bigger companies, and those bigger companies, no offense, have not been staffed by the most innovative people, right? New grads want to go to Google and Facebook and all of these companies. So you haven't had the innovation in typical telco vendors because of the underlying dependency to be those big companies that can support thousands and thousands of power supplies and blades and all of this. So by the operators basically saying, look, we don't want this to follow the model of before. We want more innovation in the space. We want to make it more software-oriented. We want it running on existing hardware. It would be so ironic if they said, but by the way, we want to keep that whole standards thing the way it's always been. I mean, you got to, for this to happen, you kind of got to change the rules all over.
Chris, you mentioned the idea of a little more friendly collaboration between what might be considered
classically competitors.
Is that a function of the community coming together to try to drive and build up really a nascent market right now, or is that increased collaboration a function of a software environment?
Partly it's a function of a software environment, so you don't have the, we talk about boxes, and a lot of times boxes kind of make you think in a certain way. And I think you gravitate to others that have a natural strength, and so a lot of those boundaries that used to be there, well, we're just an access player, all that goes away because those different layers in the network were often defined by computing capacity of each one of those boxes. Well, that sort of goes away, so everybody is even again. So, whereas we may have been competitors with Alcatel, well, what if you removed all these layers because all of it is running on standard machine? Well, maybe we're not such a competitor after all. Or you may have a common enemy, and now it makes sense to get together. But those classic boundaries fall away, and when they fall away, then you start finding a friend.
So that being the case, if software is leveling playing field, and we've spent 2 days talking about really focusing on the operator community. But what does that do for the vendor community? How do you then compete, and who ends up, for lack of a better word, winning in the space?
I think there's lots of places that everybody can play, and every vendor's got to carve out its own niche. The thing that's really interesting about this space is, look, open source is fascinating. Open source fascinates me now at the amount of stuff I can just download for free, right? And I got all this stuff on my computer at home and use all this stuff, and it's all free. And it's a model that I think some of us still struggle with. There is always going to be opportunities in there for the Red Hats of the world, the guys who deliver the hardened version. I mean, we at Metaswitch understand that we can't do it all. So we've got our little pockets of network virtualization. Some of those we've put out as open source. Some of those, of course, we'd like to deliver hardened versions of. But there's so much other work required in the open stack, so many other elements we've heard of today about the deep packet inspection part of things, the network analytics, all of those areas, that I think you just end up at this point where there are plenty of places for people to carve out their own expertise. And then in those areas, there's just going to be this level of, is your software better than their software? I mean, you get that in every industry you're in, right? You know, Word was better than WordPerfect. I know we could argue that, but you know what I mean. And there's all of these applications that are like, yeah, this one's better. So I think it works out in the same way as there's, and as I said yesterday, the biggest companies in the world are software companies, so they found a way to, get themselves some very good valuations.
I mean, I think politics make strange bedfellows.
Yeah.
So I think you're going to see in the next 2 years strange bedfellows. And these will be classic software companies pairing up or buying or doing some sort of strategic combination with classic telco suppliers. So what does the telco supplier understand? The telco supplier understands the mentality, the pace, and everything, and politically is connected with those telcos. And what does the software company bring? Expertise about how software can drive network virtualization. So I think you'll see, and you see that now. All of a sudden, VMware is a competitor, and Oracle makes an acquisition of Acme Packet, and Oracle announces, this is part of our telco strategy. I'm like, what telco strategy? I didn't know you had one, right?
That is the telco strategy.
What is that?
Yeah.
Since when do you have that? So I think you will see strange bedfellows between pure software plays and companies that understand telcos. They both need each other.
I think you should add to that as well. I mean, look at Google, right? I mean, for the longest time, Grand Central becomes Google Voice, OTT, big threat to telcos. And then if we'd gone into more detail yesterday about Google data centers and just the enormity of them and the amazing efficiency of them, and then of course they've layered on all of the software, the MapReduce, the Google file systems, the stress testing they do, the live sort of cratering of the network to make sure it still works. And you then make that available as Google Compute Engine for people to use to load up their network elements. Is Google a competitor with Google Voice, or is it a friend with its infrastructure? I mean, I think it's going to be, all of these dynamics are going to be out there.
During the RTC panel earlier today, there was some fairly decent volume of conversation around the operator, the service provider versus the large enterprise. Is this a discussion, and both of you have, play in the enterprise and the carrier space. Is this a conversation that is going to be viable in the enterprise space? And if so, is it in the same kind of time frame as we've been talking about with service providers?
I look at the presentation I made at Interop for enterprise customers, and I look at presentations I've done for service providers. I'm like, oh, there's 2 slides that are different, right? Because it's getting blurry between those two, because the economics, because virtualization expands so cost effectively, right? You don't have to have that same sort of infrastructure that always classically separated an enterprise network from a service provider network. So those two are starting to look more and more alike. It's run out of a data center, and you have these cheap, inexpensive devices that do the data forwarding. That's germane if it's an enterprise network, and it makes a lot of sense if it's a telco network. So I think it's getting blurry. I think a lot of that structure is the same, whether it's telco or enterprise.
I think you'll see some, you're going to see a lot of enterprises start to look like service providers.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about the post-carrier operator. I mean, I said yesterday, Amazon, Google all buying a lot of fiber. I mean, who's to say that the service provider of the future isn't Facebook, isn't Amazon, isn't Google, isn't Apple? So I think you've always got that balance. And something we haven't talked much about, we always talk about network function virtualization being inside the carrier network, but a lot of the activity as well is being able to download functions into virtual machines, into appliances in the enterprise, right? So a service provider could literally download almost like a firewall into a virtualized appliance on there. So NFV, yes, in the network, but also at the edge. So again, the carrier in one hand, is pushing further into the enterprise network, which we've seen over and over throughout the course of history. But on the other hand, you're going to start seeing these massive enterprises say, look, we can be the service provider now, and why not? So, yeah, I think there's all kinds of overlap. It's interesting.
Does this, are we seeing the beginning of a, and one of our keynotes kind of got into that messaging a little bit, really a network as a service mentality or market, basically buy your own or provide a network to anybody who needs it?
Yeah, I think it's network on demand. I thought Cisco did a nice job actually of talking about, and they jumped into, all right, let's just talk about as a service, network as a service. I thought he did a nice job of exploring that topic. I thought one of the most interesting things that Cisco mentioned was that concept of the router on Amazon on an hourly basis, right? It's almost like a hotel room or something. I thought that was interesting, and maybe that's the way that networks end up getting procured. And I think that becomes one of the most interesting plays, is you can instantly take those and look at those services and deploy that as a very different model. And so I think we are on the cusp of it's all about the economics and how those economics change, and it changes it dramatically and fundamentally, and all these things that never made sense in the past all of a sudden can make sense, such as an hourly rental of a router.
I really enjoyed Raj's presentation just then, and he was talking about the reasons for SDN. He was right, and someone said before that cost has not become part of the discussion. And the original SDN white paper, well, the one from the Open Networking Foundation, never mentioned cost. It was all about, look, we need to create a flexible network architecture here to support NFV. We need a flexible network architecture that can support changing traffic patterns more sort of east-west rather than north-south. We need to be able to do any BYOD, any data, any point, any device. And that this whole model was like, how do we create a network that is as agile as the enterprise data center has become? And so a lot of these initiatives are absolutely all about delivering programmable network as a service. And whether it's for some massive amount of bandwidth because I want a cloud burst and go from a private cloud to a public cloud, I want to back up something between clouds, or whether it's something as small as I want to borrow a router by an hour. That's really the model here, right? This could be, watching a Netflix Blu-ray movie and just programming that bandwidth through my network. So, yeah, the programmable network. And it's something that telcos have, how many times have we crisscrossed programmable networks, right? We go way back to different APIs. You think Parlay, you think, I remember reading an article. Have you read this stuff lately about the phone phreakers and the history of the phone phreakers? There's a guy, John Draper, and back in the 60s he was saying that he didn't view himself as a criminal. He viewed the network as being, he just saw the phone network as just being a big programmable computer. And yet telcos have never really quite embraced that, and they've never got it right, and the APIs have never worked. And I think now, not only do they have to make the network programmable, they have to make the experience of programming that network or running an app on that network as frictionless as possible. The router on demand, if you go like Amazon now and you want to spin up some AMIs, it is really, really simple. Mm-hmm. And the telco has got to make access to their network as simple as they can. And it's an oddity, because if you're the telco, you go, what about, the airlines don't give access to their networks or, traffic lights or anything. But we've defined communications now as being this personalized, I want to build this, and this, I want some of that, I don't want that. And this time they have to make it programmable, and I think the constructs of SDN and everything we're doing is talking about everything on demand.
What do you see as we've had a number of assessments in terms of how long this is all going to take. I'm not going to ask either one of you to say, okay, to tell us how long a full migration is going to take. I think we all agree there's so many variables involved there that's impossible to define, and so we won't do that. But what's a realistic time frame for us to see real progress? And I guess the first part of that is how do you define, or how would you define real progress in this space?
Yeah, I kind of look at analogs, and one of the analogs that I brought up in my presentation was the transition that carriers made from circuit-based networks to packet networks, right? And I think about, okay, how did they make that transition? And, you know, they nibbled at it. I mean, it was sort of scoffed at for a while, but they, well, at first, you know, do a few IP services, did a little bit at the, kind of on the premises and back into the edge. And, I mean, that probably took, you know, that probably took 5 years before a significant amount of that traffic was going over packet network. I mean, there was sort of a transition to cell-based networks with layer 2 networks, ATM, and then onto connectionless packet networks. But all of that probably took, you know, probably 5 years before there was a significant transition. So so now I look at this and think, well, we're probably right at the cusp now, and it's probably a 5-year transition period. But there's going to be pockets of doing it the old way for quite some time. So I would say 5 years before large carriers are really significantly into NFV.
Yeah, I think Chris is right on. I think there's this 5-year window. It's going to have a long tail. I mean, I got out of VoIP in 2002, thought we were done, and I came back in 2009 and realized we were only just starting. So these things have hugely long tails. But I think, you know, right now a service provider could get going. They can download some open source. They can play with virtual SBCs. We heard some of the presentations today on virtualized sort of network analytics. There's plenty to be done today. I think there are some big issues still to be resolved, a lot of them around management and orchestration, and a lot of them around business models and some of the hypervisor throughput and all of that. And then I really think that as you put those as the long poles in the tent, and then you look at what people can do today and what will likely happen over the next 2 or 3 years, a lot more products. I mean, anything layer 3 and above can basically be virtualized. We'll see more and more products that are getting virtualized. And I think we'll just see that sort of the momentum build through that. I would expect that to Chris's point, by 5 years from now, you're going to see legitimate deployments of this having arisen from testing as early as now, but still some work to be done, but definitely on the path.
Well, both of you have mentioned what the large tier ones may be doing in some near 5-year time frame. What about the tier 2, tier 3 operators? What's the difference in terms of what they're able to do, and does that change the time frame that they may be looking at?
Yeah, I think you do have tier 2s. Adtran serves a lot of tier 2s and tier 3s. It's kind of the strength of it. There are innovators out there in the tier 2s and tier 3s, and I think you'll see some of them sneak in and crash the party. Some of those are just as smart, and you know the economics favor ability to do this and not protecting a gigantic embedded base, all the classic things that favor a tier 2 or tier 3. So I think you'll see some of them crash the party.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we have a number of tier 2, tier 3 customers, and some of them will never get to this, and you might not expect them to. I think what's interesting is that you know, if you look at the fact that those who are trying to get off more of the subsidized revenue streams and actually doing quite a good job of it, yeah, they still have a rational regulatory strategy. They still want to track that. They still want to be represented by things like the NTCA. But they understand what's changing. They understand, you know, Wheeler's coming in and he's got his agenda, and the big guys are trying to get what they want out of it. And if we fast forward to that world of IP interconnectivity and, you know, less and less subsidization, then you're going to need this flexible architecture to survive. Now, you may just choose to be a pipe provider and say, that's it, that's all I want. But if you are in the multi-line business and you are in a multi-service business, then you're going to need that. The beautiful thing about the cloud, especially once you get over the hump of I don't necessarily have to build this myself. Sure, there'll be times I build it myself. But if you even for a moment consider going and taking a public cloud service, my credit card, Steve Gleave's credit card, is as good as Randall Stevenson's credit card. I mean, it really is. They don't differentiate, right? You roll up and say, I need this much storage and I need these many AMIs. It's like, sure, go ahead. So there's nothing that prevents a tier 3 leveraging the exact same capability and cost benefits as the biggest telcos in the world. It's an incredible leveler from that perspective. All of these buying rights and powers go out the window.
Steve, you just mentioned that you know, there's some of those tier 2 or tier 3 players who may never get to this place. I believe it was our IBM speaker yesterday made the comment that if you don't get there, you're not going to be selling product. Is that true?
It all depends. There's going to be a need for some operators out there to run high-cost local loops to remote destinations. There's going to be room for that. There are going to be some people who are incredibly niche who offer certain services to certain retails, certain services to certain verticals, and can do that with a certain architecture. But I think if generically, if you consider yourself to be in a multi-service business, then you're going to have to move that. And that doesn't mean that's the only way. You may decide to, be acquired. You may get together to do bigger things. But unless you've got a niche figured out, then it's going to be tough to keep that 100-year-old family business running for another 100 years. It's certainly not going to be run on the business that was. And I think people get that. I do. They have to figure out where they fit.
We have at Transserve, we have a product, the TA5000, which is a multi-service. Tier 2s and Tier 3s love it because you can plug in anything and deliver any type of service. It'll be many years from now before we sell the last TA5000. I mean, it's a popular product, and it's a classic telco product, but I think that'll continue to be popular with the Tier 2s and Tier 3s. A lot of them do exist on subsidized revenue to service a certain part of the country, right? And they'll continue to do well. It's a lifestyle business for a family, and that'll continue to be popular. But there will be ones that realize both the CapEx advantage and the fact that maybe you don't need a CCIE to program all of these routers and switches to create a service. I just need a guy that understands enterprise software to create that. So it's not just saving on CapEx, but my personnel changes, and it changes to a lower cost labor cost.
I would say one thing that's just crossed my mind. Look, these guys don't typically motivate themselves, right?
The Tier 2s and 3s.
The Tier 2s and 3s. They need a lot of work, need a lot of pushing.
Yeah.
I was reading about that guy, I forget his name now, it was Roland Stewart or something. He was the guy back in the 70s, Rainbow Man, had that big afro.
He was at every sports event?
Yeah, and he'd stand there with John 316.
Yeah.
And
whatever happened to that guy?
Well, I get this because I read about him. He's actually serving a triple life sentence right now. I think we all knew he was whacked anyway. Maybe there's a happy ending. No, he's in prison. But I was just thinking, these Tier 1s, these Tier 2 cities, they kind of need us with that, software telco sign at major sport events. They kind of need to be reminded over and over and over. They kind of need that, like, oh, there it is again, there it is again. So no question, some of them get it. No question, some of them won't. But they absolutely need us to continually be pointing them in that direction.
So that kind of gets to my next question anyway. Who continues? Folks like you, some of our other speakers and sponsors have obviously started to lead this charge. Will the vendor community continue to drive this market, or is somebody else going to sort of take the helm?
Well, I think there's multiple forces moving on this, not just the vendor community, but Etsy, standards bodies are moving it, and the carriers are there. As we mentioned, the paper that they wrote, and that was done through cooperation and some of the leading thinkers. So, that's one of the reasons why I think this is a trend that has some steam behind it, is the fact that you've got multiple organizations behind that. It's not just the vendor community. I have seen those trends where the vendor community will try to push something and that doesn't go so far. And I've seen ones from just the service providers. But the fact that we've got three forces in here gives me pause to think, I think this one's got staying power.
Yeah, I think we're past the tipping point. If you look at everybody in this room who is what I would call a classic vendor, we're all in agreement, which is fabulous. First time I've seen that, maybe ever. If you look at in the cloud space, with the Amazon website, I can now get certified in AWS. Amazon's going to push that forward, right? Maybe AWS is the new CCNE for all I know, right? So there's going to be movement from there. There's going to be movement from the open source community and everything that's happening there. So, Yeah, I think we've kind of tipped. I actually joked with some analysts the other week that if this doesn't happen, I can't be calling them up as Metaswitch in a year going, hey, it's all about femto cells. Let me tell you about that. Right?
Whatever happened to that other thing you were talking about?
That was so 2013, NFE, everybody was just, it was a big head fake. So no, I think there were so many pockets in the industry and then in associated and augmented industries that are all just tilting it this way. Yeah, I don't see how we have a Dallas moment, wake up from a bad dream and carry on.
Before we move on, I do want to offer up an opportunity to ask questions to our audience. Anybody have questions? Yes, sir.
I've heard all week that there's a tremendous opportunity for room for entry into the market, right? It seems like the bar to entry is lower and lower. I feel like incumbents are going to feel pressure to put some barrier to entry into the market. And I was wondering if you could talk about the risk reward about them trying to put those barriers of entry into this space.
I mean, the incumbent operators or the large incumbent vendors?
Vendors is what I was thinking. The large incumbent vendors, they have a lot of turf to protect. I can only imagine they're thinking about ways to raise the bar, a barrier to entry. What is the risk reward in your mind of them doing that?
Yeah, I think you're on a really good point. I think that I think a lot of incumbents are going to take this approach of, look, this can't happen too fast or literally, our business goes crazy. So they're certainly going to be sowing some FUD in with the tier ones. There's going to be this theme of, look, we get telcos, right? All these guys who come out writing apps in their underwear in some dungeon, they don't know telcos. We get telcos, we know how to help telcos. And I think telcos will actually respond to that. Likewise, these large OEMs absolutely understand that what they wrote on proprietary hardware fundamentally does not just lift up and move into virtualized environments. And the native development there is of interest to them. They're threatened by open source, but likewise they're keen to figure out how to embrace that. How do they get in the hard model? So I think that the stalling is we get telcos. This isn't going to happen overnight, but they do have to find ways to embrace a lot of the things that have been talked about here today. And I actually think that you'll see the OEMs take that approach. I think you'll see the telcos respond to it. They're not going to throw out all of their existing vendors overnight, but they're going to want to see some real movement towards this promised land and not just a bunch of sort of feet dragging and throwing anchors off the side of the boat.
Yeah, I think your question is good. You must work for an enlightened company. Works for Adtran.
That kind of question.
Yeah. All right. Who I've been observing on this is how Cisco's reacting, right? I mean, because if you look at this, we're competitors with Cisco, but even if I wasn't, I'd be observing how are they reacting, and because they have a lot to lose here. I mean, if this thing really changes and how they've built their business and with the service providers, they've got a lot to lose. That's why I thought it was interesting what Cisco focused on was managed services and how to use this for managed services. I thought, oh, brilliant, right? Because they have a play in the enterprise. That makes a lot of sense that they're doing that. Also, I've seen Cisco kind of move away from OpenFlow, try to say it might be a different type of protocol. And I thought, well, maybe if Cisco or anyone for that matter could control that whatever de facto protocol ends up being what the industry uses, then they can kind of control where that goes, as they did with operating systems on routers. So I do think that there are competitors who, on the vendor side, not the service provider side, vendor side, trying to figure out how can I control and make money on this, especially if I have this massive embedded base and this massive revenue flow from maintenance and coverage on all of this, and what do I do on that? But I think they're going to move in a stealthy manner, in a wise manner. I don't mean underhanded, but I mean they're going to think this through. They're a smart company. But I think Cisco's probably the most interesting company to watch on the moves that they make with respect, so it doesn't become a threat for them and they can continue to be successful.
Yeah, it does remind me, I saw Jeff Pulver speak one time about the history of Vonage, and he said when he started Vonage, he insisted on hiring nobody who'd ever worked for a telco. He didn't want anybody coming in with, oh, this can't be done, the kind of mentality. And obviously, Jeff was successful with Vonage. I think what's slightly different here is that, you look at vendors who have that telco pedigree. You want to see that they're leading in NFV. You want to see that they're doing good things in NFV. But that telco pedigree is actually valuable because you can't just completely ignore it when you're talking about taking what was once the world's most complex machine and sticking it into VNFs, which could be on, to Raj's point, anywhere right here and there. And so I think you need that pedigree, but you need to have some of that leadership. And hopefully what comes out of all of this by making it software is that you continue to put smart people, fresh grads, into these companies that have been historically legacy telco providers. So, if that all pans out, it would be awesome. But clearly, all kinds of bumps and twists and turns.
The other one I'm watching that I can't tell what is Ericsson, and I can't quite tell what they're hard to figure out anyway. They're in Sweden. What are they doing? I mean, they're ice skating or what? I don't know. They're ice fishing. What are they? But that's the other one I've been looking at. It would seem that they have, would have an interest in this to see, and I think that's the other one I've been observing closely.
Any other questions out in our audience?
So, what do you think about the trend of network equipment manufacturers buying OSS providers? Is it better to have each stack from one company, or is it better to have some separation so that each can develop independently? And from say an AT&T point of view, AT&T is not going to have all Ericsson. So, does it really want, a VSS that's tailored only for Ericsson equipment?
The odd thing, this is a good question in any context, even if it wasn't network functions virtualization, right? What I have observed on OSS with service providers, it's kind of like the weather. They will complain incessantly about it, but they don't want to pay a lot for it. For some reason, they talk a lot about it, but they don't ever want to pay for it. But so the challenge then for vendors is, you'll hear this from service providers. Oh, the OSS and this is, all our OpEx is in that. Please fix this problem, right? Then you go off and buy an OSS company, right? Pay a lot of money for them, get them in there, and then the service provider hardly wants to pay anything for it. It's just one of these weird things that there's, a lot of seeming pent-up demand, there's a lot of desire, but it doesn't match willingness to pay with these service providers. So different large equipment vendors have made those acquisitions, and it's really been hard to get them those things to pay off because it seems like the service provider wants it for free in the end of the day. That's what I've observed. That has nothing to do with network functions virtualization apart from the fact that maybe you can reduce the cost by running that on a virtual machine.
I think I'm actually really fascinated by the other direction, which I'll get to. The network equipment manufacturer, the hardware company, if you like, buying a software company, I'm not sure that it's a recipe for success. We have OSS stuff inside our portfolio. I can't make these kind of statements, not that we're public, but I don't see us buying those kind of OSS, BSS companies, especially when you start moving to what looks like an all IT infrastructure. That's really nothing that we would know much about. However, I'm fascinated by the larger software companies buying the network equipment companies. So this was mentioned a minute ago, but Oracle buying Acme Packet. I thought Acme Packet was well done, good company, good run. I was fascinated by Oracle software company buying something that was ostensibly a hardware appliance with tightly coupled software and underlying hardware. But when you think about the long term, they're looking at, can these elements be transported into the domain we fully understand? So, I don't track much of the equipment manufacturers buying the OSS companies, but when the large software companies go shopping, I think that's really interesting.
Well, I think that really speaks to everything that we've been talking about here today, is that everything is all moving into towards software.
Right. It really is.
What's the next step if we all agree that we're going soft, the world is going software, what's the next step, and what's the first thing that you as the vendor community have to do with regards to the service provider world in terms of getting them to believe?
Well, I think they're there. The fact that I can't remember which presentation brought this up, the AT&T 2.0, that the fact that they put that out. I mean, that's a statement of belief, and I think maybe the world changes when AT&T, one of the largest carriers, says, okay, here's we've issued this. This is what we're looking for, solutions, and then in a year's time or however long it takes them, when they say, yep, here's what we're doing. We're using this piece and this piece and this piece. Boom, there it is. So I think that they've stated that they believe. So I guess the next step is for them to be baptized or confirmed or whatever, or choose your religion, or the bar mitzvah is next. I mean, it's coming, and but they've stated that they believe, and I think AT&T's behavior after that with a set of vendors, I think that kind of defines it, and then they're committed.
Yeah, I think there's not to put the onus on the operator, the vendor community has actually done a huge amount. This is legitimate, and operators in the AT&T Domain 2.0 announcements are certainly very interesting. Lots of other operators. I mean, ever since we released the open source IMS code, we know how many operators have taken that and downloaded it. And I think what's fascinating about it was that if we hadn't done that as open source, that would have probably taken like 5 years to get into these labs. Because it's open source, any guy in a tier 1 can say, doesn't need any budget approval, just downloads it, starts playing with it, has questions. Suddenly this thing starts sort of permeating internally. And what's happening is people are going, this is actually quite real. And then they start looking at other virtual products. And yes, we have a virtual SBC, but so do lots of other good vendors out there. And so suddenly you start looking at that, and then you start seeing these virtual analytics packages and virtual DPI. And it's legit. And vendors can demonstrate real scalable, massively scalable solutions here. Sure, there's stuff to resolve, but I think now, more public engagement from the operator community helps this thing go forward. But I would imagine every engineering team of every vendor who is here is working very hard on these virtualizing or rewriting code or whatever that takes. And I think the operators, it's actually sort of hit them between the eyes, like, oh my God, this actually is real, and it's not just a bunch of marketing rhetoric. So I think there's onus on everybody now to say, okay, well, let's really start stressing this, and let's really start thinking about how it could be deployed.
So one last question to wrap up. Let's, originally I had mentioned 3 years. Assuming we all gather again in, say, about a year's time, how does the discussion change? What are we talking about? How has the landscape changed? And maybe most importantly, are there new people that are involved in the conversation that have come into it in the next 12 months?
Yeah, I think alliances will start to be formed. I think you'll look in your bowl of cereal, those Cheerios kind of like cluster together. You will see Cheerio clusters in the next, in the next 2 years. Those will start forming up, those alliances. Like I said, it could be strange bedfellows. But I think that's what you're going to start to see, a combination of software expertise and telco expertise among the vendors, and that's what you'll see forming up. They'll form up because they see those opportunities. They'll see definitions coming from those service providers. Presentations I've done, if I go out to the service providers and talk about this, used to they'd always say, can you do the Katy Perry Venn diagram again? I think that's so funny. And then now they want to talk more about unifying the control plane and how SDN will do that. So I get much more interest in that. That fact that there is that more interest, the short-term thing that you'll see short-term, 18 months, is alliances starting to be formed in that vendor community to address the opportunity.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think the difference from this a year from now, I actually think that you've got a majority of vendors here, not that many service providers. It makes absolute sense based on where the industry is at. I would absolutely hope a year from now you'll see more service providers. You may even get some service providers presenting, just saying, hey, here's what we learned.
Yeah.
This is very transparent. It's like, well, we tried this with a hypervisor, it didn't work, put KVM in, seemed a little bit better. And at some point, you're going to hopefully have a guy on this stage from Amazon or Rackspace or the guys that are, bringing in that side of it. So I think you're just going to see the broadening of that community. I actually think that this is a very, very important first step to put a marker out there and say people are discussing it in this type of community. And I would expect a broader and deeper selection of people. And I think that would speak volumes.
Wonderful. Chris, Steve,
Pleasure.
thank you so very
Yeah.
much for joining me up here. I want to thank one more quick thank you to our sponsors and our exhibitors for making this event possible. Thank you and our audience for joining us. I certainly encourage you to get in touch with us if you have comments, if you have feedbacks, in addition to the evaluation forms. We love hearing from you. If you have suggestions on how we can make this show even better in the future, we'd love to hear from you. Stay in touch on our websites, the SDN Zone, NFV Zone. Again, always love hearing from our readers and our audience. Thank you very much.